Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so this is, let's be honest, the graveyard of all graveyard shifts, 2:45 on a Friday after. But I'll try and make it as interesting as I possibly can. Some of you might know I emigrated to Australia, and I've been doing quite a lot of talks to Australian audiences, and I thought maybe this one would be different, because usually I always start with a point of reassurance to the audience that I am actually speaking English. I didn't think I would need to do that with this audience, but I know we'll get an international contingent, so I am speaking English. Okay, first of all, thank you to Andrew and to SIPR for bestowing this significant honour on me. We've been talking today about the first James Smart lecture that we used to go to, and so it is a big thing for policing. And when you see some of the people that have given this talk before, like Andy Rhodes and people like Eliza Manning and Buller and Ali Hadari and Keir Starmer, and maybe not Keir Starmer so much, but the imposter syndrome is coming through, and also with all the people that know me in here, you know, that really know me and know me as the charlatan I am. It's like, as Billy Connolly says, singing to your auntie. But let's see how we got on. I'd like to start with James Smart himself. Born in Cathcart, Glasgow on the 22nd of March 1804. And like many, he had a bit of an unconventional route into policing, because he started his working life as a tea salesman. And the company he was working for almost immediately went bankrupt. So he found himself in London, and he joined the Metropolitan Police. Didn't fancy that all that much, and he left after 4 months, and his old boss had started up the tea company again, so he went back and he worked as a tea salesman for his old boss, and then it almost immediately went bankrupt again. So he found himself in Glasgow, and he joined the Borough of Calton Police in 1831, and by 1835 he was superintendent of the Borough of Calton Police. And then in 1848 he was appointed the head of the City of Glasgow Police, and at that point it was chief superintendent, but over his tenure an act came into place which made him chief constable, and he was the first chief constable in Scotland, and he served for 22 and a half years as the chief of police in Glasgow, which I can see the police officers in the room going pale just at the thought of sitting in a job like that for 22 and a half years. I got interested in what he did though as chief constable, because policing at that point, the police service that he inherited, policing didn't just do what you might have thought traditionally in that day a police service did, which was just focus on crime. The police officers swept the streets. The police officers lit the gas lamps. The police officers enforced public health laws. And for most of his tenure, that was what policing did. And you can see, I mean, even way back then, his service was the embodiment of a public health approach to policing at its very foundation. But one of at the time in Glasgow, Industrial Revolution, it was a burgeoning city. The expansion of tenement flats in Glasgow was significant. But the tenements weren't lit, the hallways weren't lit, and it was an offence for the public to light the hallways. But they did it anyway because it was unsafe. So technically the police should prosecute people for lighting, but they never did, because it was an obvious thing to do and it'd be a waste of resources, etc. But Chief Constable Smart realised that there was a real safety issue here, and he started haranguing Glasgow City Council at the time and telling them that the responsibility should be theirs to light the stairways. It's keeping people safe, etc., and all these people are breaking the law, and you're letting them do it. And they refused, they just dismissed them. So it's quite an interesting tactic. He started prosecuting people for lighting the hallways. But his intention wasn't to punish or to convict, it was to make a point. And over the course of 2 months, he sent 17,500 cases of people lighting the hallways to the Crown Office at that time, which overwhelmed the criminal justice system and brought it to a standstill. And within 2 months of that, Glasgow City Council started lighting the closes. And one of the other things that James Smart did was he approached the Scottish office at the time, about midway through his tenure, and he requested, and they followed his request, he requested that they start collecting crime data, because he wanted to show and analyse the data and show what policing did, and show what types of crime are happening in the communities. That hadn't happened before. And from that point on, the Scottish office started collecting crime data which he could use and analyse and demonstrate the demands that were on policing and the impacts that were happening in the community. So there's your first very early version of evidence-based practice being used. Can also just spend a wee bit of time and look at academia in that time as well. Because there were only 4 universities in Scotland there, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, St Andrews and Glasgow. There were only 2 in London. But even then, universities weren't, as we know them now, they weren't enshrined into public life in the same way. They were socially elite institutions that educated. They trained physicians and lawyers and ministers. And really any kind of thought for Chief Constable Smart that an academic professor from Edinburgh University would have anything to do or provide any advice to policing would be completely alien to him. I mean, for him, policing was about guile and about knowledge that you get in the streets. It was not what you read in a paper. Academics were thinkers and not doers, and the relationship between academia and public services was one which was pretty much mutually exclusive in those days. So I just wanted to do that with a bit of an intro. We're talking about policing and academic partnerships here. I tried to be a good student, a good scholar, as we were discussing last night, what's the difference, and actually look at what some of the literature, the academic literature tells you about what we're talking about. We're talking about policing and academic partnerships. There is so much, though. There is an awful lot of literature on that. I liked in the top left there what Chaplin said about fragile alliances, and they didn't talk about necessarily the nature of the relationship being fragile, but actually something that needs constant attention and constant work. I like that, but I am not an academic, and I felt a bit overwhelmed reading all of this, and my wee brain was starting to melt, and I thought I cannot get a fix on it. So I did, and I turned to a source that I often turn to help me just cut through a lot of noise in my head. My 9-year-old son, Hamish. Now, Hamish is probably the human embodiment of a randomised control trial, to be honest, most of the time. But I asked him the question, can you tell me what you think a partnership is? And he got a look in his face that I recognised, which was going to, and I saw that it was going to be one of those rare occasions he actually thought and considered about what he was going to say before he actually just answered. So I rushed for a piece of paper, and this is this piece of paper. And again, like a good academic, I'm going to read you verbatim what Hamish's definition of a partnership is. A partnership is when 2 people or peoples get together because they like each other and the same things and doing the same stuff and stuff. They always get along well all of the time, except when they don't. And they sometimes disagree and argue, but even that's okay, because in the end, it usually turns out that mum's right. Genius! A genius! So, let's use that as our definition, shall we, going forward. Where are we with policing and academic partnerships now? You know, I'm just looking at being honest about where that relationship is. And somebody, Monica mentioned to me earlier, you know, you talk about a bridge, and I thought, have you seen my presentation? Because sure enough, because there's a natural gap there, isn't there? And what I tried to depict with this particular image is where I think policing and academic partnerships are in Scotland at the moment. I think we're very lucky that we have a fantastic bridge there. We've got a structure that allows access to either side of the gap. Because as I've been hearing this week with the summer school from some of the people overseas, you have to navigate a gap without any kind of structure in place. In Scotland, we are very lucky that we have a structure. But it's a bit foggy in the middle sometimes. Now that fog doesn't necessarily stop people crossing, but sometimes it can make us a bit reluctant or dissuade us from actually traversing across the structures that we've put in place. And I thought it would be worthwhile to actually have a look at what is it that causes that fog, or what creates a gap in the first place in respect of partnerships and the difficulties that might have in negotiating them. Police and academics, I think, they're trying to make the sense of the same problems, and they're trying to do that in the same ecosystem. But we organise and perceive the world differently. I think police value certainty, they value speed, they value control, they value short-term results and gains, they value actionable findings. Academics tend to value nuance and critique and challenge and long-term study and continuous review. I think research in criminology and policing is by its nature oriented towards questioning, challenging and unsettling received wisdom. Policing by its nature is about stability and confidence and authority. These are not the same orientation when you think about it. Canterbury Christchurch researchers put it pretty plainly, and they said one of the greatest differences between police and academia is their essentially opposed idea as to what constitutes knowledge. That's the first thing, the first point. The second thing, and I think everybody's mentioned it this week and everybody will recognise it, in policing you don't stay in, especially if you're a policing leader, you don't stay in the same job for that long. Now I was the executive lead for academic partnerships while I was carrying out a role in partnerships for Police Scotland. I was the ACC in charge of partnerships. I was in that role for 4 years, which is a pretty long time for a police officer to be in that role. So that churn, and when you're dealing with partners who are in a career for the same career and dealing with the same partners for a whole generation, to constantly have that churn, because partnerships tend not to survive a leader leaving in policing sometimes. And I saw an interesting stat about in America, around 70% of police and academic partnerships lasted less than 1 year, and about 80% of those collapsed at a leadership change. Something fundamentally at issue there. Academia, organised around specific grant, policing not that dissimilar. When the money goes, what do? We don't jump into a partnership like we should. We take a step back. And not just about academic partnerships. I think in any type of partnerships across services, it's a retrenchment to what's core and what your core service delivery is. And then everybody will have a different idea about actually what a core service delivery is for policing and academia. But when the funding goes, it creates an issue. And we've heard about this today, about this access to what information an academic requires to do a particular piece of research. Because policing can be really enthusiastic about that to start with. And I've seen it and I've done it myself, where somebody had said, that piece of work you done was fantastic. Can I come and study it? Yeah, of course, I'd love you to do that. Can I see your strategy and your policy and your thinking behind it? Yes, of course. And can I interview you? Oh, that's fine, I'd love you to interview me. And can I interview your officers? We could maybe select one or two. Okay, and can I get access to your data and systems? No, you're just being annoying. I think there are structural issues, but I think part of the issue is relational, as we've heard before, and Cynthia spoke about that this morning. It's absolutely right. The foundation of it is relational. And another part of it is institutional, because we've got data protection, we've got information security, we've got natural reticence, we're worried about what the public might perceive. But my view is if you don't get the relational part right, it's going to be very difficult for you to try and negotiate and navigate the institutional elements that make gatekeeping and access an issue. And then lastly, a bit of top-down imposition from both sides. And I remember having these conversations with Liz Aston when I was at the start of my tenure there. I was saying, well, here's the policing strategic priorities. I'd like the research that SIPR supports to be about advancing them. And Liz would say, yeah, but the difficulty is I've got the academic side to satisfy as well. I've got the priorities of academia, and I've got to justify funding this. And sometimes I think if policing was to say, no, you're going to do this, then you're going to get the buy-in from academia. If academia say, well, we need to do this, you're going to get that buy-in. So everything is a negotiation. But sometimes it goes really well. And I want to just go through a couple of case studies of when it goes well, because as I say, it is a Friday afternoon. Let's be positive and optimistic. And the one obviously I'll know, and there's probably a sweep on going for the time that I've mentioned naloxone. I think that's 15 minutes for whoever's got that in the sweep. Naloxone nasal spray, some of our American colleagues will know it as Narcan. For anybody that doesn't know what it is, it's an opioid recovery first aid technique, whereby if someone is suffering an opioid overdose, a spray in naloxone can allow them to come around, buys them time until the ambulance gets there, potentially saves their life, because if they're in an overdose, then they're very close to death. In Scotland in 2019, there was a bit of a moral panic. There was a huge societal issue, or there still is a huge societal issue, but back then it very much came to the fore because Scotland was the worst country in Europe in respect to drugs deaths, and not just the worst country, but the second worst country. We were 4 times worse than the second worst country, and it was a huge problem and a source of shame, I think, for anybody in the nation. And the Scottish Government started to be very proactive about it, and there was a request to every public service to actually look at what they could do to address this horrendous situation that we found ourselves in, where we had 3 vulnerable people a day dying from drugs overdose. And policing were asked to consider carrying naloxone because officers have the proximity in communities, and they're often the first people there when someone is in public or in a house in an overdose situation. And they would get there before the ambulance, and them acting quickly and using naloxone could buy that person, as I say, a few seconds. But policing had the default position in policing up until then was to oppose that, because, and for many reasons, some of them being like, well, we're kind of stepping too much into the health side of things then at that point. That's a health issue. That's not a policing issue. And this is mission creep, and we've really got to be careful around that. How exposed are our officers? What happens if the person dies? I mean, the person's dying anyway. That's the situation that we're in. So some of the arguments were a bit specious. But that was the situation that we found ourselves in, was this opposition. And the public were opposed as well. They didn't want the policing to be getting involved in this in some areas. But we thought that we had to do something, and this would be something that we should look at. But we weren't actually able just to make that policy decision at the time because of this opposition. So we had a pilot. And that pilot, we chose 3 areas: Glasgow, Falkirk and Dundee. We trained 800 police officers in the use of naloxone in person, and this was still around about 2020, so first phase of COVID. And at the end of that training, we told the officers that they could have the choice as to whether they carried naloxone and carried it on their belt and used it for the 6-month period that we would be running the pilot. And what we realised at that point was that we couldn't mark our own homework with this. It would not be influential enough, because the criticisms were, you already want to do this and you're going to run a pilot and everybody knows what the result of the pilot's going to be. You've already written the last page of the report. So we requested the Scottish Centre for Policing and Public Health, which is our colleagues at Napier University primarily, to carry out an independent evaluation of naloxone. And what they did was they had, just running through this very quickly, they had an online survey of the police officers participating